The Colour of Magic by Terry Pratchett. The podcast versions of the original Facebook live readings by Matthew Ogden, the Bearded Wit. Please bear in mind, as usual, that these are live recordings, so there are the odd fluff here and there, the odd stumble, and quite often laughter, as the reader appreciates the humour along with you, the listener. Don't forget to like, share, and make sure that absolutely everybody you know that might like this is aware of these recordings. Thanks very much. Before we start, I would ask you to go over to patreon.com/thebeardedwit and become a patron of the podcast. This podcast is only possible because of the generosity of my patrons. You can become a patron from as little as $5 a month, which is the price of a good cup of coffee, or even a bad cup of coffee in some places. But that does mean that I'm able to keep recording this material and get it out there for you as soon as possible after broadcast on Facebook. So the link is patreon.com/thebeardedwit. $5 a month makes all the difference in the world to me. I'd like to thank all of the patrons that have supported me so far, and I hope the new patrons will enjoy what I do as much as everyone else does. Thanks very much. Now then, sit back, put your feet up, and enjoy the reading. Part 1. Quick intro. Terry Pratchett, fantastic writer, British writer, very sadly passed away, massively prolific, produced a metric ton of novels. I think he churned out about 2 or 3 a year at some points. First published back in the 80s, which is when I first came across him. My best mate, Ian Power, who now lives in Australia, introduced me to this first book back in 1980. I'm not old, he says, hiding the silver beard. And it was love at first read. I absolutely adore the world that Pratchett creates, and I think you will too if you're not already familiar with it. So enough of that preamble. Let's crack on. We're starting with the first book, and we'll go on from there. So, Prologue. In a distant and second-hand set of dimensions, in an astral plane that was never meant to fly, the curling star mists waver and part. See. Great Artuin, the turtle, comes, swimming slowly through the interstellar gulf, hydrogen frost on his ponderous limbs, his huge, ancient shell pocked with meteor craters. Through sea-sized eyes that are crusted with rheum and asteroid dust, he stares fixedly at the destination. In a brain bigger than a city with geological slowness, he thinks only of the weight. Most of the weight is, of course, accounted for by Beryllia, Tubal, Great Typhon, and Jerakeen, the 4 giant elephants upon whose broad and star-tanned shoulders the disk of the world rests, garlanded by the long waterfall at its vast circumference and domed by the baby blue vault of heaven. Astropsychology has been, as yet, unable to establish what they think about. The great turtle was a mere hypothesis until the day the small and secretive kingdom of Krull, whose rimmost mountains project out over the rim fall, built a gantry and pulley arrangement at the tip of the most precipitous crag, and lowered several observers over the edge in a quartz-windowed brass vessel to peer through the mist veils. The early astrozoologists, hauled back from their long dangle by enormous teams of slaves, were able to bring back as much information about the shape and nature of Artuin and the elephants, but this did not resolve fundamental questions about the nature and purpose of the universe. For example, what was Artuin's actual sex? This vital question, said the astrozoologist with mounting authority, would not be answered until a larger and more powerful gantry was constructed for a deep space vessel. In the meantime, they could only speculate about the revealed cosmos. There was, for example, the theory that Artuin had come from nowhere and would continue at a uniform crawl, or steady gait, into nowhere, for all time. This theory was popular among academics. Gotcha. An alternative, favoured by those of a religious persuasion, was that Artuin was crawling from the birthplace to the time of mating, as were all the stars in the sky, which were, obviously, also carried by giant turtles. When they arrived, they would briefly and passionately mate, for the first and only time. And from that fiery union, new turtles would be born to carry a new pattern of worlds. This was known as the Big Bang hypothesis. Thus it was that a young young cosmocolonian of the Steady Gate faction, testing a new telescope with which he hoped to make measurements of the precise albedo of great Artuin's right eye, was on this eventful evening the first outsider to see the smoke rise hubward from the burning of the oldest city in the world. Later that night he became so engrossed in his studies he completely forgot about it. Nevertheless, he was the first. There were others. The colour of magic. Fire roared through the bifurcated city of Ankh-Morpork. Where it licked the wizard's quarter, it burned blue and green, and was even laced with strange sparks of the eighth colour, octarine. Where its outriders found their way into the vats and oil stores along Merchant Street, it progressed in a series of blazing fountains and explosions. In the streets of the perfume blenders, it burned with a sweetness. Where it touched bundles of rare and dry herbs in the storerooms of the drug masters, it made men go mad and talk to God. By now, the whole of downtown Morpork was alight, and the richer and worthier citizens of Ankh on the far bank were bravely responding to the situation by feverishly demolishing the bridges. But already the ships in the But already the ships in the Morpork docks, laden with grain, cotton, and timber, and coated with tar, were blazing merrily, and their moorings burnt to ashes, were breasting the river Ankh on the ebb tide, igniting riverside palaces and bowers as they drifted like drowning fireflies toward the sea. In any case, sparks were riding the breeze and touching down far across the river in hidden gardens and remote rickyards. The smoke from the merry burning rose miles high, in a wind-sculpted black column that could be seen across the whole of the Discworld. It was certainly impressive from the cool, dark hilltop a few leagues away, where two figures were watching with considerable interest. The taller of the pair was chewing on a chicken leg and leaning on a sword that was only marginally shorter than the average man. If it wasn't for the air of wary intelligence about him, it might have been supposed that he was a barbarian from the Hubland wastes. His partner was much shorter, and wrapped from head to toe in a brown cloak. Later, when he has occasion to move, it will be seen that he moves lightly, cat-like. The two had barely exchanged a word in the last 20 minutes, except for a short and inconclusive argument as to whether a particularly powerful explosion had been the oil bond store or the workshop of Kerrible the Enchanter. Money hinged on the fact. Now the big man finished gnawing at the bone and tossed it into the grass, smiling ruefully. "There go all those little alleyways," he said. "I liked them." "All the treasure houses," said the small man. He added thoughtfully, "Do gems burn, I wonder? 'Tis said they're akin to coal." "All the gold melting and running down the gutters," said the big one, ignoring him, "and all the wine boiling in the barrels." "There were rats," said his brown companion. "Rats, I'll grant you." "It was no place to be in high summer." "That too. One can't help feeling, though, a momentary—" He trailed off, and then brightened. "We owed old Fredor at the Crimson Leech 8 silver pieces," he added. The little man nodded. They were silent for a while as a whole new series of explosions carved a red line across a hitherto dark section of the greatest city in the world. Then the big man stirred. "Weasel?" "Yes?" "I wonder who started it." The small swordsman, known as the Weasel, said nothing. He was watching the road in the ruddy light. Few had come that way since the Deosil gate had been one of the first to collapse in a shower of white-hot embers. But 2 were coming up it now. The Weasel's eyes, always at their sharpest in gloom and half-light, made out the shapes of 2 mounted men, some sort of low beast following behind them. Doubtless a rich merchant escaping with as much treasure as he could lay frantic hands upon. The Weasel said as much to his companion, who sighed. "The status of footpad ill suits us," said the barbarian, "but, as you say, times are hard, and there are no soft beds tonight." He shifted his grip on his sword, and as the leading rider drew near, stepped out onto the road with a hand held up and his face set in a grin nicely calculated to reassure yet threaten. "Your pardon, sir," he began. The rider reined in his horse and drew back his hood. The big man looked into a face blotched with superficial burns and punctuated by tufts of singed beard. Even the eyebrows had gone. "Bugger off," said the face. "You're Bravd the Hublander, aren't you?" Bravd became aware that he had fumbled the initiative. "Just go away, will you?" said the rider. "I just haven't got time for you. Do you understand?" He looked around and added, "That goes for your shadow-loving fleabag partner too, wherever he's hiding." The Weasel stepped up to the horse and peered at the dishevelled figure. "Why, it's Rincewind the wizard, isn't it?" he said in tones of delight. Meanwhile, filing the wizard's description of him in his memory for leisurely vengeance. "I thought I recognised the voice." Bravd spat and sheathed his sword. It was seldom worth tangling with wizards. They so rarely had any treasure worth speaking of. "He talks pretty big for a gutter wizard," he muttered. "You don't understand at all," said the wizard wearily. "I'm so scared of you, my spine has turned to jelly. It's just that I'm suffering from an overdose of terror right now. I mean, when I've got over that, then I'll have time to be decently frightened of you." The Weasel pointed towards the burning city. "You've been through that?" he asked. The wizard rubbed a red raw hand across his eyes. "I was there when it started. See him back there?" He pointed down the road to where his travelling companion was still approaching, having adopted a method of riding that involved falling out of the saddle every few seconds. "Well," said Weasel. He started it, said Rincewind simply. Bravd and Weasel looked at the figure, now hopping across the road with one foot in a stirrup. Fire Razor, is he? Said Bravd at last. No, said Rincewind, not precisely. Let's just say that if complete and utter chaos was lightning, then he'd be the sort to stand on a hilltop in a thunderstorm, wearing wet copper armour and shouting, "All gods are bastards!" Got any food? There's some chicken, said Weasel. I'll exchange it for a story. What's his name? Said Bravd, who tended to lag behind in conversations. Twoflower. Twoflower? Said Bravd. What a funny name. You, said Rincewind, dismounting, do not know the half of it. Chicken, you say? Devilled, said Weasel. The wizard groaned. That reminds me, added the Weasel, snapping his fingers, there was a really big explosion about, half an hour ago? Oh, that was the oil bond store going up, said Rincewind, wincing at the memory of the burning rain. Weasel turned and grinned expectantly at his companion, who grunted and handed over a coin from his pouch. Then there was a scream from the roadway, cut off abruptly. Rincewind did not look up from his chicken. One of the things he can't do, he can't ride a horse, he said. Then he stiffened as if sandbagged by a sudden recollection, gave a small yelp of terror, and dashed into the gloom. When he returned, the being called Twoflower was hanging limply over his shoulder. It was small and skinny, and dressed very oddly in a pair of knee-length breeches and a shirt in such a violent and vivid conflict of colours that Weasel's fastidious eye was offended even in the half-light. No bones broken by the feel of things, said Rincewind. He was breathing heavily. Bravd winked at the Weasel and went to investigate the shape that they assumed was a pack animal. You'd be wise to forget it, said the wizard without looking up from his examination of the unconscious Twoflower. Believe me, a power protects it. A spell? Said Weasel, squatting down. No, but magic of a kind, I think. Not the usual sort. I mean, it can turn gold into copper while at the same time it is still gold. It makes men rich by destroying their possessions. It allows the weak to walk fearlessly among thieves. It passes through the strongest doors to leech the most protected treasuries. Even now it has me enslaved, so that I must follow this madman willy-nilly and protect him from harm. It's stronger than you, Bravd. It is, I think, more cunning even than you, Weasel. What's it called, then, this mighty magic? Rincewind shrugged. In our tongue it is called reflected sound as of underground spirits. Is there any wine? You must know that I am not without artifice where magic is concerned, said Weasel. Only last year did I, assisted by my friend there, part the notoriously powerful archmage of Mutri from his staff, his belt of moon jewels, and his life, in that approximate order. I do not fear this reflected sound of underground spirits of which you speak. However, he added, you engage my interest. Perhaps you would care to tell me more. Bravd looked at the shape on the road. It was closer now, and clearer in the pre-dawn light. It looked, for all the world, like a box on legs, he said. I'll tell you about it, said Rincewind, if there's any wine, that is. Down in the valley there was a roar and a hiss. Someone more thoughtful than the rest had ordered to be shut the big river gates that were at the point where the Ankh flowed out of the twin city. Denied its usual egress, the river had burst its banks and was pouring down the fire-ravaged streets. Soon the continent of flame became a series of islands, each one growing smaller as the dark tide rose. And up from the city of fumes and smoke rose a broiling cloud of steam, covering the stars. Weasel thought that it looked like some dark fungus or mushroom. The twin city of proud Ankh and pestilent Morpork, of which all the other cities in time and space are, as it were, mere reflections, has stood many assaults in its long and crowded history, and has always risen to flourish again. So the fire and its subsequent flood, which destroyed everything left that was not flammable, and added a particularly noisome flux to the survivors' problems, did not mark its end. Rather, it was a fiery punctuation mark, a coal-like comma, a salamander semicolon in a continuing story. Several days before these events, a ship came up the Ankh on the dawn tide, and fetched up, among many others, in the maze of wharves and docks on the Morpork shore. It carried a cargo of pink pearls, milk nuts, pumice, some official letters for the patrician of Ankh-Morpork, and a man. It was the man who engaged the attention of Blind Hugh, one of the beggars on early duty at Pearl Dock. He nudged Cripple Wah in the ribs and pointed wordlessly. Now the stranger was standing on the quayside, watching several straining seamen carrying a large brass-bound chest down the gangplank. Another man, obviously the captain, was standing beside him. There was, about the seaman, every nerve in Blind Hugh's body, which tended to vibrate in the presence of even a small amount of impure gold at 50 paces, screamed into his brain the air of one anticipating imminent enrichment. Sure enough, when the chest had been deposited on the cobbles, the stranger reached into a pouch, and there was the flash of a coin. Several coins. Gold. Blind Hugh, his body twanging like a hazel rod in the presence of water, whistled to himself. Then he nudged Wah again and sent him scurrying off down a nearby alley into the heart of the city. When the captain walked back onto his ship, leaving the newcomer looking faintly bewildered on the quayside, Blind Hugh snatched up his begging cup and made his way across the street with an ingratiating leer. At the sight of him, the stranger started to fumble urgently with his money pouch.
"Good day to thee, sire,"
Blind Hugh began, and found himself looking up into a face with 4 eyes in it. He turned to run. Said the stranger, and grabbed his arm. Hugh was aware that the sailors lining the rail of the ship were laughing at him. At the same time, his specialized senses detected an overpowering impression of money. He froze. The stranger let go and quickly thumbed through a small black book he had taken from his belt. Then he said, "Hello."
"What?"
said Hugh. The man looked blank. "Hello," he repeated, rather louder than necessary, and so carefully that Hugh could hear the vowels tinkling into place.
"Hello yourself,"
Hugh riposted. The stranger smiled widely, and then fumbled yet again in the pouch. This time his hand came out holding a large gold coin. It was, in fact, slightly larger than an $8,000 Ankian crown, and the design on it was unfamiliar. But it spoke inside Hugh's mind in a language he understood perfectly. "My current owner," it said, "is in need of succour and assistance. Why not give it to him so you and me can go off somewhere and enjoy ourselves?" Subtle changes in the beggar's posture made the stranger feel more at ease. He consulted the small book again. "I wish to be directed to an hotel, tavern, lodging house, inn, hospice, caravanserai," he said. "What, all of them?" said Hugh, taken aback. "Huh?" said the stranger. Hugh was aware that a small crowd of fishwives, shellfish diggers and freelance gawpers were watching them with interest. "Look," he said, "I know a good tavern. Is that enough?" He shuddered to think of the gold coin escaping from his life. He'd keep that one, even if Emor confiscated all the rest. And the big chest that comprised most of the newcomer's luggage looked to be full of gold. The four-eyed man looked at his book. "I would like to be directed to an hotel, place of repose, tavern..." "Yes, all right, come on then," said Hugh hurriedly. He picked up one of the bundles and walked away quickly. The stranger, after a moment's hesitation, strolled after him. A train of thought shunted its way through Hugh's mind. Getting the newcomer to the broken drum so easily was a stroke of luck, no doubt of it, and Emor would probably reward him. But for all his new acquaintance's mildness, there was something about him that made Hugh uneasy. And for the life of him, he couldn't figure out what it was. Not the two extra eyes, odd though they were. There was something else. He glanced back. The little man was ambling along in the middle of the street, looking around him with an expression of keen interest. Something else Hugh saw nearly made him gibber. The massive wooden chest, which he had last seen resting solidly on the quayside, was following on its master's heels with a gentle rocking gait. Slowly, in case a sudden movement on his part might break his fragile control over his own legs, Hugh bent slightly so that he could see under the chest. There were lots and lots of little legs. Very deliberately, Hugh turned around and walked very carefully towards the broken drum. "Odd," said Emor.
"He had this big wooden chest,"
added Cripple War. "You'd have to be a merchant or a spy," said Emor. He pulled a scrap of meat from the cutlet in his hand and tossed it into the air. It hadn't reached the zenith of its arc before a black shape detached itself from the shadows in the corner of the room and swooped down, taking the morsel in mid-air. "A merchant or a spy?" repeated Emor. "I'd prefer a spy. A spy pays for himself twice, because there's always the reward when we turn him in. What do you think, Weasel?" Opposite Emor, the second greatest thief in Ankh-Morpork half closed his one eye and shrugged. "I've checked on the ship," he said. "It's a freelance trader. Does the occasional run to the Brown Islands. people there are just savages. They don't understand about spies, and I expect they eat merchants."
"He looked a bit like a merchant," volunteered War, "except he wasn't fat."
There was a flutter of wings at the window. Emor shifted his bulk out of the chair and crossed the room, coming back with a large raven. After he'd unfastened the message capsule from its leg, it flew up to join its fellows lurking among the rafters. Weasel regarded it without love. Emor's ravens were notoriously loyal to their master, to the extent that Weasel's one attempt to promote himself to the rank of greatest thief in Ankh-Morpork had cost their master's right-hand man his left eye. But not his life, however. Emor never grudged a man his ambitions. "B12, said Emor, tossing a little file aside and unrolling the tiny scroll within.
"Gorin the cat," said Will automatically, "on station up in the Gong Tower at the Temple of Small Gods."
"He says Hugh has taken our stranger to the Broken Drum. Well, that's good enough. Broadman is a friend of ours, isn't he?"
"Aye," said Weasel, "if he knows what's good for trade."
"Among his customers has been your man Gorin," said Emor pleasantly, "for he writes here about a box on legs, if I read this scroll correctly." He looked at Weasel over the top of the paper. Weasel looked away.
"He will be disciplined,"
he said flatly. Wah looked at the man leaning back in his chair, his black-clad frame resting as nonchalantly as a Rimland puma on a jungle branch, and decided that Gorin atop Small God's temple would soon be joining those little deities in the multifold dimensions of beyond. And he owed Wah 3 copper pieces. Emor crumpled the note and tossed it into a corner. "I think we'll wander along to the drum later on, Weasel. Perhaps, too, we may try this beer that your men clearly find so tempting." Weasel said nothing. Being Emor's right-hand man was like being gently flogged to death with scented bootlaces. The twin city of Ankh-Morpork, foremost of all the cities bounding the Circle Sea, was, as a matter of course, the home of a large number of gangs, thieves' guilds, syndicates, and smaller organisations. This was one of the reasons for its wealth. Most of the humbler folk on the Widdershins side of the river, in Morpork's mazy alleys, supplemented their meagre incomes by filling some small role for one or other of the competing gangs. So it was that by the time Hugh and Twoflower entered the courtyard of the Broken Drum, the leaders of a number of them were aware that someone had arrived in the city who appeared to have much treasure. Some reports from the more observant spies included details about a book that told the stranger what to say, and a box that walked by itself. These facts were immediately discounted. No magician capable of such enchantments ever came within a mile of Morpork docks. It still being that hour when most of the city was just rising or about to go to bed, there were few people in the drum to watch Twoflower descend the stairs. When the luggage appeared behind him and started to lurch confidently down the steps, the customers at the rough wooden tables, as one man, looked suspiciously at their drinks. Broadman was browbeating the small troll who swept the bar when the trio walked past him. "What in hell's that?" he said. "Just don't talk about it," hissed Hugh. Twoflower was already thumbing through his book. "What's he doing?" said Broadman, arms akimbo. "It tells him what to say. I know it sounds ridiculous," muttered Hugh. "I've got a book. Tell a man what to say." "I wish for an accommodation, a room, lodgings, the lodging house, full board. Are your rooms clean? A room with a view. What is your rate for one night? Said Twoflower in one breath. Broadman looked at Hugh. The beggar shrugged. He's got plenty money, he said. Tell him it's 3 copper pieces then, and that thing will have to go in the stable. Said the stranger. Broadman held up 3 thick red fingers, and the man's face was suddenly a sunny display of comprehension. He reached into his pouch and laid 3 large gold pieces in Broadman's palm. Broadman stared at them. They represented about 4 times the worth of the broken drum, staff included. He looked at Hugh. There was no help there. He looked at the stranger. He swallowed. Yes, he said in an unnaturally high voice. And then there's meals, of course. You understand? Yes, food. You eat. No? He made the appropriate motions. What? Said the little man. Yes, said Broadman, beginning to sweat. Have a look in your little book. I should. The man opened the book and ran a finger down one page. Broadman, who could read after a fashion, peered over the top of the volume. What he saw made no sense. Food, said the stranger. Yes, cutlet, hash, chop, stew, ragout, fricassee, mince, collops, soufflé, dumpling, blancmange, sorbet gruel, sausage, not to have a sausage, beans without a bean, kickshaws, jelly jam, giblets. He beamed at Broadman. All that? Said the innkeeper weakly. It's just the way he talks, said Hugh. Don't ask me why he does, he just does. All eyes in the room were watching the stranger, except for a pair belonging to Rincewind the wizard, who was sitting in the darkest corner, nursing a mug of very small beer. He was watching the luggage. Watch Rincewind. Look at him. Scrawny, like most wizards, and clad in a dark red robe on which a few mystic sigils were embroidered in tarnished sequins. Some might have taken him for a mere apprentice enchanter who'd run away from his master out of defiance, boredom, fear, and a lingering taste for heterosexuality. Yet around his neck was a chain bearing the bronze octagon that marked him as an alumnus of Unseen University, the high school of magic whose time and space transcendent campus is never precisely here or there. Graduates were usually destined for mageship at least, but Rincewind, after an unfortunate event, had left, knowing only one spell, and made a living of sorts around the town by capitalising on an innate gift for languages. He avoided work as a rule, but had a quickness of wit that put his acquaintances in mind of a bright rodent, and he knew sapient pearwood when he saw it. He was seeing it now, and he didn't quite believe it. An archmage, by dint of great effort and much expenditure of time, might eventually obtain a small staff made from the timber of the sapient pear tree. It grew only on the sites of ancient magic. There were probably no more than 2 such staffs in all the cities of the Circle Sea. A large chest of it. Rincewind tried to work it out, and tried to work it out, and decided that even if the box were crammed with star opals and sticks of auriculatum, the contents would not be worth 1/10 the price of the container. A vein started to throb in his forehead. He stood up and made his way to the trio. "May I be of assistance?" he ventured. "Shove off, Rincewind," said snarled Broadman. "I only thought it might be useful to address this gentleman in his own tongue," said the wizard gently. "He's doing all right on his own," said the innkeeper, but took a few steps backward. Rincewind smiled politely at the stranger and tried a few words of Chimeran. He prided himself on his fluency in the tongue, but the stranger only looked bemused. "It won't work." "Won't work, said Hugh knowledgeably. "It's the book, you see. It tells him what to say. It's magic." Rincewind switched to High Borogravian, to Vangelmesht, Sumtree, and even Black Urugu, the language with no nouns and only one adjective, which is obscene. Each was met with polite incomprehension. In desperation, he tried heathen trob, and the little man's face split into a delighted grin. "At last," he said. "My good sir, this is remarkable." Although in Trob the last word in fact became "a thing which may happen but once in the usable lifetime of a canoe hollowed diligently by axe and fire from the tallest diamondwood tree that grows in the noted diamondwood forests on the lower slopes of Mount Awaiwaya, home of the fire gods, or so it is said." "What was all that?" said Broadman suspiciously. "What did the innkeeper say?" said the little man. Rincewind swallowed. "Broadman," he said, "2 mugs of your best ale, please." "You can understand him?" "Oh, sure." Tell him he's very welcome. Tell him breakfast is 1 gold piece." For a moment Broadman's face looked as though some vast internal struggle was going on, and then he added with a burst of generosity, "I'll throw yours in too." "Stranger," said Rincewind levelly, "if you stay here, you will be knifed or poisoned by nightfall. But don't stop smiling, or so will I." "Oh, come now," said the stranger, looking around. "This looks like a delightful place, a genuine Morporkian tavern. I've heard so much about them, you know, all these quaint old beams, and so reasonable, too." Rincewind glanced around quickly in case some leakage of enchantment from the magician's quarter across the river had momentarily transported them to some other place. No, this was still the interior of the drum. Its walls stained with smoke, its floor a compost of old rushes and nameless beetles, its sour beer not so much purchased as merely hired for a while. He tried to fit the image around the word quaint, or rather the nearest Trob equivalent, which was that pleasant oddity of design found in the little coral houses of the sponge-eating pygmies on the Orohai Peninsula. His mind reeled back from the effort. The visitor went on, "My name is Twoflower," and extended his hand. Instinctively, the other 3 looked down to see if there was a coin in it. "Pleased to meet you," said Rincewind. "I'm Rincewind. Look, I wasn't joking. This is a tough place." "Good! Exactly what I wanted." "Huh? What is this stuff in the mugs?" This? Beer. Thanks, Broadman. Yes, beer. You know, beer." "Ah, the so typical drink. A small gold piece will be sufficient payment, do you think? I don't want to cause offence." It was already halfway out of its purse. Yeah, what?" croaked Rincewind. I mean, no, it won't cause offence. Good. You say this is a tough place. Frequented, you mean, by heroes and men of adventure? Rincewind considered this. Yes, he managed. Excellent! I would like to meet some. An explanation occurred to the wizard. Ah, he said, you've come to hire mercenaries. Warriors who fight for the tribe with the most milk-nut meal. Oh, no, I just want to meet them, so that when I get home, I can say that I did. Rincewind thought a meeting with most of the drum's clientele would mean that Twoflower never went home again, unless he lived downriver and happened to float past. Where is your home? He inquired. Broadman had slipped away into some back room, he noticed. Hugh was watching them suspiciously from a nearby table. Have you heard of the city of Pelagic? Well, I didn't spend too much time in Trob. I was just passing through, you know. Oh, it's not in Trob. I speak Trob because there are many Betrobi sailors in our ports. Pelagic is the major seaport of the Agatean Empire. Never heard of it, I'm afraid. Twoflower raised his eyebrows. No? It is quite big. You sail turnwise from the Brown Islands for about a week, and there it is. Are you all right? He hurried around the table and patted the wizard on the back. Rincewind choked on his beer. The counterweight continent? Right. I think that's where we'll leave it for tonight. We have an introduction to the two main protagonists, which we will spend a lot of time in whose company we will spend a lot of time in over the next few weeks. Thank you all so much for joining me this evening. Once again, if you get a chance, please do go over to patreon.com/The Bearded Wit and become a patron and support what I'm doing. But otherwise, I've already put up another event for next week. I will encourage you to smash, like, follow, whatever, and make sure you stay up to date with the things that I'm doing. And I will have this edited into a decent form and put onto the Word podcast, that's the one, as soon as possible. But thank you all so much for joining me this evening. It's been great to see so many of you here. And I will see you same time next week. It's great to be doing this again. Take care, everyone. See ya.